If someone offered you a crown, would you take it? Would you wear the robe, the jewels, the weight of a kingdom on your shoulders? Or would you walk away from the throne and never look back? It's a soft question, but not an easy one. Power has a glow, but it also casts a long shadow. Now gently settle in wherever you are. What time is it where you are listening from tonight? Are you in bed, resting your head against the pillow? Or somewhere far away, letting the hush of history drift around you? Let this story guide you softly into sleep. It begins not with a war or a coronation or a roaring crowd, but with a quiet boy, standing at the edge of a hallway in a palace too large for his voice. His name was Albert, and he was never supposed to be king. Born second in line, he lived in the golden blur, behind his older brother Edward, the prince everyone noticed. Edward smiled like he was born to rule. Albert stammered. His words came out cracked and uncertain. His childhood was filled with stiff collars, cold tutors, and a stutter that became louder every time he tried to hide it. He learned early how to shrink himself, how to listen without speaking, how to be royal without ever believing he could lead. Because why would he? The crown wasn't for him. The world already had its prince. But history, as it often does in these quiet regrets, turned the page in an unexpected way. Edward, charming, confident, adored, fell in love with a woman the palace would never accept. And when it came time to choose between the woman he loved and the crown he was born to wear, Edward chose love and stepped down. Just like that, and in the echo of that decision, the silence grew loud. All eyes turned to Albert, the boy who couldn't speak without trembling. The man who had spent a lifetime hiding behind the one who walked away. He had never wanted the throne, and now it was his. There was no speech, no ceremony that could prepare him for that moment. Only the weight of something he had feared all his life, falling quietly into his hands. And so began the reign of King George VI, the king who never wanted to be king at all. The day he became king, there was no celebration in his chest, only the cold hush of responsibility pressing inward like a winter wind. Albert was now George VI, a name he chose not for glory, but for stability. It was his father's name, a name rooted in duty. The world was trembling, inching toward the Second Great War, and England could not afford uncertainty. So the boy who never wanted the crown stood beneath its golden weight, smiling carefully while something inside him whispered, "You do not belong here." The microphones terrified him the most. Sleek and metallic, they waited like open mouths, hungry for words he could not give. His stutter, which had haunted him in childhood, now stood like a ghost behind every speech. He would read the words over and over again in his study, late into the night, lips trembling, hands clenched behind his back so no one would see. The silence between words was longer than it should have been, the pauses deeper, the fear constant. And though he practiced, though he was patient, though he worked harder than anyone saw, the voice of a king remained locked somewhere behind his ribs. It was not only the stammer that weighed on him, it was the gaze of the people, the press, the politicians, even his own family, all waiting, watching, wondering whether the shy man, who shook during speeches, could ever lead a country into war. And then there was Edward, his brother, the ghost of another possibility. Even after abdication, Edward lingered in public fascination. People whispered that Albert had stolen the crown, that the wrong man wore it, that perhaps, just perhaps, he was only a placeholder for a missing prince. These whispers did not fade in George's ears. They echoed. And still he endured. He worked. He sat for hours with his speech therapist, Lionel Logue, an Australian with a warm voice and unorthodox methods. In those rooms, behind closed doors, George VI was not a king. He was just a man, frightened, human, trembling. He practiced phrases again and again. He swore, shouted, sang vowels to loosen the muscles that would not obey him. He laid bare his soul, stammer by stammer, hoping that somewhere in the repetition a rhythm might rise. And slowly it did. Not perfection, but presence, not fluency, but courage. And yet, even as he gained ground in his voice, he lost ground in the world. Hitler marched across Europe. Fear cracked through cities like thunder. And England turned to its monarch, not for military leadership, but for reassurance, for calm, for strength, for a voice. The irony was cruel. The man who feared speaking now had to speak for everyone. When war was declared, George stood behind the radio microphone, hands shaking, eyes fixed on a single phrase. "We are at war with Germany." The words did not come smoothly, but they came. And for many, it was not the strength of his speech that comforted them. It was the trembling, the pauses, the effort, the sound of a man trying. Because that, more than any royal power, was real. He became a symbol not through dominance, but through quiet resilience. Yet inside the palace, the silence remained. He did not celebrate small victories. He did not allow himself joy. The war took his health slowly, first in sleeplessness, then in stomach aches, then in deep exhaustion that medicine could not fix. He traveled constantly, visiting bombed cities, hospitals, factories, always smiling, always nodding, always pushing down the part of him that whispered, "This is not your crown." In public, he was brave. In private, he withered. He missed his brother, even in betrayal. He feared the burden he might pass to his daughter. He walked the gardens of Buckingham Palace alone in the evenings, staring at the statues as if they might answer the questions he dared not ask aloud. The war dragged on. The air grew heavier. His face aged 10 years in half that time. And yet, he endured, not because he believed he was meant to, but because there was no other choice. This was the shape of duty. This was the shape of a crown worn by someone who never wanted it. The silence followed him everywhere. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of sacrifice. The kind of quiet that wraps around a person's ribs and makes a home there. The kind that no one hears unless they, too, are carrying something they never asked to hold. There are kings who rule through command, and there are kings who rule through presence. George VI ruled through silence. The war stretched across every part of England now, in the skies, in the fields, in the steady absence of sons at dinner tables. Bombs fell like thunder, unpredictable and merciless, and yet the king stayed in London. He could have left. He could have hidden far from the flames, from the blackouts, from the glass-shattered windows of Buckingham Palace. But he did not. When the bombs came, he remained. Once, a blast shattered the windows of his study, and the ceiling above his head cracked like a falling star. He didn't flinch, or perhaps he did, but only in private, because the people were watching, and a trembling king still had to look brave. And so he walked, through the rubble, through the neighborhoods where the air tasted of ash and grief, through the hospital corridors where young men stared up with bandaged eyes, waiting for something more than medicine. They wanted to know it had meant something that someone saw them. And George, in his careful silence, offered that. He didn't speak often. He didn't deliver grand speeches or promises of glory. Instead, he stood beside them. He shook their hands. He looked them in the eye. And in doing so, he became something rare, a symbol of presence without pride. At night, he returned to his study, letters stacked in towers, maps unfolded across oak desks, and always, beside him, the weight of decision. Some nights, he prayed, not for victory, but for endurance, for the strength to wear a crown that still didn't feel like his. Sometimes he thought of Edward, of what could have been, of how different it all might have turned out if love hadn't pulled the throne from one brother's hands into another's. He did not speak of that. But the shadow of it lived behind his eyes. His daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, became his quiet light. He watched them grow, watched Elizabeth study, watched her stand tall and still and regal in a way that reminded him both of hope and of inheritance. He knew the crown would fall to her next. And though he loved her, there was sorrow in that. Because he knew too well what the crown cost, how it reshaped a person, how it asked not for excellence, but for sacrifice. He didn't want that for her, not yet, not so young. But time, like war, waits for no one. The nights grew longer, his health worsened. He smoked more, coughed more. His hands sometimes trembled, even without microphones. Doctors came and went, and though they offered names for his ailments, no name ever captured what truly ailed him. It was not the lungs, not the heart. It was something quieter, a grief of the soul, a slow erosion of self. Every morning he dressed like a king. Every evening he sat in stillness, wondering if his silence had done enough. For how does a man measure his reign when his greatest act was simply staying, not running, not retreating, just remaining, holding steady while the world fell apart around him? And yet, within that stillness, the people found something sacred. They didn't speak of him as a warrior or a visionary. They spoke of him as a comfort, as someone who had stayed when he could have gone, as someone who spoke not to impress, but to try. He was their king not because he was born to it, but because he carried it even when it didn't fit. And, sometimes, in the halls of the palace, when the lights were low and the doors shut for the night, he would walk alone past portraits of kings before him, men who led through battle, men who shouted orders into the wind. And he would pause quietly, wondering if they ever felt like this, like imposters wearing someone else's legacy. But those paintings never answered. They simply stared back, frozen in frames that had no memory of doubt. Only George VI knew what it was like to be handed a throne in the shadow of a brother's love, to lead a nation through fire with a voice that stumbled, to spend his reign wishing only to be strong enough to not let anyone down. And as the war neared its end, as bells began to ring not for mourning but for peace, he stood once more before the people. This time, the words came more smoothly. The pauses were smaller, but the weight in his eyes remained. Victory did not erase what had been lost, and even in celebration, there was quiet. Because a king may lead a nation, but it is the weight he carries alone that defines him. And George VI carried that weight with a sorrow that never left his shoulders, not even in peace. The war had ended, but for George VI, the battle had simply changed shape. There were no more bombs falling, no more sirens screaming through the London night, but the quiet that replaced them wasn't peace. It was pressure. It was recovery cloaked in exhaustion. The streets filled with voices again, but the palace halls remained the same, long, polished, echoing with decisions. And in those halls, the king walked slower now, shoulders slightly lower, his breath slightly shorter. He had led them through the darkness, yes, but he had left pieces of himself along the way, pieces no one could stitch back together. And so, even as the world looked ahead with celebration, George began to look quietly backward. He turned, his thoughts more and more to his daughter, Elizabeth, who was still so young, still radiant with possibility, and yet no longer untouched by the crown's shadow. He had shielded her from as much as he could during the war, letting her grow with dignity, not burden. But the time for protection was fading. Now he had to prepare her for the thing he had never wanted for himself, the silence of the throne. It wasn't just about ceremonies or documents. It was about the loneliness. He knew it well. It's that quiet space behind every smile. the gap between what a monarch feels and what a monarch must show. And he saw in Elizabeth a kind of strength that frightened and comforted him all at once. She was composed, measured, graceful, and he loved her deeply. But sometimes, when she spoke in that clear voice, he felt the sting of what he had never been able to say. He did not speak of his stammer to her often. He did not tell her about the long nights repeating words, the panic before each broadcast, the self-doubt that sat beside him like a second crown. But he showed her not in words, but in patience, in the way he greeted staff, in the way he bowed slightly to people who expected no bow, in the way he read her eyes when she asked hard questions. And so she learned, not through instruction, but through observation. Still, he worried. How could he not? Every time she stood beside him during official duties, his gaze flickered not with pride, but with protection. Not yet, he would think. Not yet. But time doesn't wait for readiness, and the years moved quickly after the war. He took her on tours, watched her address crowds, watched her greet leaders. He coached her on protocol, taught her how to read a room without reacting, how to speak without trembling. And though she wore these lessons well, he could see it, the moment drawing closer. The moment she would have to wear what he had carried. In the evenings, after the palace was quiet, he sometimes found himself in the music room, the same, one that had once frightened him in childhood, the room where echoes carried in silence sang louder than sound. He would sit there alone, not playing anything, simply letting the quiet settle. It reminded him of how far he had come, and how far his daughter would still have to go. His health declined in steps. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just a little less energy, a cough that lingered. Then more hospital visits, then the surgery, and yet he never stopped working. Not because he believed the nation could not continue without him, but because he believed she wasn't quite ready. Or maybe that he wasn't ready to let go. He had never truly accepted the crown as his own. And now, after carrying it for so long, the idea of placing it on someone else's head, even someone he loved, was both relief and heartbreak. He began writing letters, quiet ones, soft ones, for Elizabeth, for Margaret, for his wife. Not dramatic declarations, just thoughts, observations, little things he wanted to say in case the time slipped past him without warning. Because that was how death came for kings, not always with a bang, but often with a quiet sigh. And still, in public, he smiled. He waved. He attended ceremonies, though each one left him more tired than the last. The photographs from those days show a man regal and steady. But if you look closer, you'll see it. The sadness around the eyes, the way his hands hold one another too tightly, the thinness in his cheeks. The world celebrated the return of peace, the rebuilding of hope. But within the palace, there was another quiet war, one man preparing to step away, and another era quietly preparing to begin. Elizabeth knew it too. She saw the tiredness. She watched her father with more stillness now, less daughter, more observer. She felt the crown inching closer, even if no one dared say it aloud. And George VI, the king who had never wanted the crown, now found himself in an impossible place, hoping to hold on just long enough to give her more time. And knowing, in his heart, that time was slipping, not just from the calendar, but from his very body. The weight he had carried was almost ready to be passed, and with it, the silence that had defined him, the silence of duty, of fear, of resilience, would find a new home. In the daughter he had taught not to speak like a king, but to stand like one. When she returned, the air itself felt different. The sky over London hung heavier than before, as if the clouds knew what had been lost. Queen Elizabeth, barely into her 20s, stepped from the plane not as the daughter of a king, but as the monarch herself. The transformation was quiet, but total. Her black coat moved gently in the wind, and though her face remained composed, the softness around her eyes betrayed something deeper, the weight of sudden inheritance. The people bowed to her now. They used the word Your Majesty instead of Princess. But within her, she was still the girl who had stood beside her father, watching him struggle with microphones and duty and silent storms he never named. His absence was everywhere in the palace walls, in the way the servants lowered their eyes when she passed, in the chair that no one dared move in his study. His scent still lingered faintly in the hallway outside his bedroom. His gloves remained untouched, and yet there was no time for stillness. The machinery of monarchy turned quickly. Meetings, papers, visits, speeches. It moved like a clock, ticking forward whether the heart was ready or not. Elizabeth had always known this day would come, but knowing did not ease the ache. And so, each morning, she put on the weight. Not just the crown, which would come later, but the invisible weight of expectation, of comparison, of legacy. In private, she would sometimes pause by her father's old desk, running a finger softly over the grain of the wood. She did not speak to anyone about these moments. She carried them. She remembered the way he had held his breath before speaking, the way his voice trembled, then steadied, the way he walked slightly slower after every hospital stay. Though she did not stammer, though her voice was strong and sure, she spoke as if remembering him, not imitating, but honoring. People watched her closely in those early months. Would she be strong? Would she be modern? Would she lead like her father, or break from his quiet ways? But she was not him, and yet she was shaped by him. Not in the grand gestures, but in the restraint. In the way she chose her words carefully. In the way she stood without needing to command. In the way she absorbed the gaze of millions without flinching. Even now, years after his death, his ghost lingered in soft ways. In the way a letter was signed. In the hymn she chose for state occasions. In the slight downward tilt of her head when meeting someone new, a gesture he had taught her, meaning, I see you. And sometimes, late at night, she would wander the palace corridors as he once had, pausing in the same rooms. The music room, the garden hall, the private chapel. She did not always enter. Sometimes she simply stood by the door, as if waiting for a sound that would never come. And yet, in those silences, he felt near, not as a king, but as a man. A father who had never asked for his role, but had fulfilled it anyway. And now, she was doing the same, carrying what had been handed to her not through ambition, but through necessity. Her mother would sometimes say his name softly during dinners, a memory drifting into conversation like steam off a teacup. And Elizabeth would smile gently, allowing the moment to pass without holding it too tightly, because grief had become a companion now, not loud, not sharp, just present, a quiet reminder that every step she took forward had once been his. And though the crown now belonged to her in some small way, it always carried the imprint of his hands. She began to meet world leaders, sit through long council sessions, face the press, face the pressure. And through it all, there was an invisible thread. What would he have done? What would he have said? In time, people stopped comparing her to him. She became her own queen. But in her private heart, she knew. Her reign had begun in the echo of his. And no matter how far she walked through decades of change, through waves of history, she would always be walking from the place where he had quietly stood, teaching her not through power, but through presence. The shadow of his reign was not dark, it was soft, like early morning fog, like memory, like a silence that stays even when the room has emptied. And within that shadow, she had found the shape of her own strength. Time, like ivy, grows over even the most solid stone. And as the years began to move forward, the memory of King George VI slowly began to soften, not because he was unloved, but because he had never sought to be remembered loudly. He was not the kind of king who filled history books with thunder. He was not the face of revolutions or scandals. He had no golden victories carved into stone. What he left behind was quieter, like pressed flowers in a forgotten book, and the world, hungry for new stories, began to turn its gaze elsewhere. Elizabeth's reign was unfolding now, young and radiant, filled with color and ceremony and a promise of modernity. Television cameras followed her every step, documenting a queen who was both ancient and new. Her coronation was broadcast to millions. Her voice echoed beyond palaces, across oceans. And slowly, the world began to call her the Queen, with capital letters and unwavering reverence. The man who had worn the crown before her, the man who had never wanted it, faded quietly behind the curtain. Statues were not built in his name, no great monuments, no sweeping tributes. And perhaps that was exactly as he would have wanted. But even so, for those who had lived through his reign, his memory remained tucked inside them like an old photograph, worn at the edges, but never discarded. Veterans remembered his hand on their shoulder, his awkward but honest gaze. Hospital nurses remembered the way he lingered by bedsides longer than required. Factory workers remembered him visiting in the rain, hat in hand, asking questions they hadn't expected a king to care about. These weren't grand stories, but they were the kind that stayed. In small English villages, his portrait still hung in some living rooms, not because it was fashionable, but because it meant something. He had been theirs, not perfect, not poetic, but present. He had stood with them when bombs fell. He had spoken, even when his voice cracked. He had reigned not like a lion, but like a quiet oak, steady, rooted, waiting out the storm. Children born after his death learned of him only through old textbooks, black and white photos, the occasional film reel. To them, he was the man before the queen, a name on a family tree, a ghostly pause between two great eras. But in the quieter corners of history, the footnotes, the memoirs, the fading memories of those who knew him, George VI remained more than that. He was the bridge between silence and strength, a king who showed that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands still and endures. His speeches were sometimes played on Remembrance Days, not because they were eloquent, but because they were human. Every pause, every stumble, every breath was a testament to effort, and that effort, over time, became its own kind of nobility. As Elizabeth's reign grew longer and more complex, filled with its own trials, its own triumphs, she occasionally mentioned her father in quiet ways, not in speeches, but in gestures, the way she dressed, in the hymns she chose, in the way she walked slowly through war memorials, stopping not to speak, but simply to stand. And those who had known him, even briefly, would sometimes write to the palace, not expecting a reply, just to say, I remember the king who came to my village, the king who stuttered through a message on the radio while I sat by candlelight, the king who smiled at me through the crowd. Those letters never made headlines, but they made their way to the archives, to the quiet drawers of history where the unsung are kept. The crown had moved on. The world had changed. But the echo of George VI lingered, not loudly, not urgently, just there, like the last note of a song that had meant more than anyone realized until the music stopped. And perhaps in that quiet remembrance, in the small, fading stories, passed down across dinner tables and dusty bookshelves, he found the legacy he never sought but always deserved. Years passed, and the image of King George VI faded from the public eye, slowly replaced by the symbols of a newer, brighter reign. Postcards bore Elizabeth's face now. Coins shone with her silhouette. Children grew up, saluting a queen whose grace and endurance defined an era. but somewhere in the quieter folds of memory, George remained, not as a grand monarch carved into the marble of history, but as a man whose legacy lived in the way he carried the crown. Not with flourish, not with hunger, but with care. And as Elizabeth matured into her role, something unspoken tethered her to him, a kind of silent dialogue between past and present. She never claimed to be the queen because of her father, but everything in her poise, her restraint, her patient silences echoed the man who had once stood where she now stood. There were moments when the crown felt heavy to her, though she rarely admitted it. Public duty had no space for fatigue. But when she visited places her father once walked, factories, schools, bombed-out cities now rebuilt, she could feel him there, not in spirit, but in memory, in impression. The crown had passed from one head to another, but it had never truly left the space it occupied in the hearts of those who saw it as burden, not glory. George had believed deeply in that the crown was not a prize, but a responsibility. He had not fought for it. He had not craved it. It had come to him through absence, and he had worn it out of necessity. And yet because of that, or perhaps in spite of it, he had worn it with more dignity than those who had sought it eagerly. That truth, over time, became more visible, not in headlines, but in whispers. In the way older courtiers spoke of him with a reverent quiet. In the way the archives preserved his letters, his memos, his corrections in pencil on speeches he practiced for hours. One such letter, written in his final year, had remained unread for decades. Tucked into the folds of an old leather-bound folder, it was a note to Elizabeth, handwritten, unpublicized, never quoted by biographers. In it, he had written, "You will wear this crown longer than I ever did, and with more ease. But never let it become a shield. Let it be a mirror and check each morning, not how it fits your head, but how it rests on your heart." It was not a royal decree. It was a father's hope. And when it was finally discovered by royal archivists years later, it was never released to the press. The Queen, upon seeing it, simply closed her eyes and held the paper against her chest for a moment before nodding to the staff to preserve it. That was all, because she understood something no headline ever could, that her strength had been shaped by the quiet burden her father had once carried. And even now, decades after his death, she was still learning from the crown he had worn. The crown he had never asked for. Visitors to Windsor Castle, unaware of the story, sometimes paused before his portrait, a modest painting near the far wall of a hallway few people lingered in. His expression there was subdued, almost hesitant. No scepter, no grandeur, just a tired but steady gaze. And those who took the time to look closely often said the same thing. He looks kind. Not regal, not powerful, just kind. And that kindness, that simple humanity, had become his legacy. A crown passed down not in thunder, but in trust, in endurance, in quiet love. And as the decades unfolded, and as the world changed and changed again, there remained deep within the DNA of the monarchy a thread that led back to him, a steady hand, a broken voice that still tried, a man who showed that you do not have to want the crown to carry it well. There was a room in the palace that remained mostly untouched after his death, not because it was forbidden, but because no one quite knew what to do with it. It was not grand or ceremonial. It held no throne, no crown, no national treasure. It was, simply, his study. A modest space tucked between long corridors and high-windowed rooms. Its walls lined with pale wood bookshelves and weathered wallpaper that had faded at the corners. The desk still held his inkwell, his fountain pen, and a small brass bell, no longer used. The curtains were often left half-drawn, letting in a soft gray light that fell gently across the rug, where his chair had once pressed permanent indentations into the floor. After he passed, the staff cleaned it only once, delicately, carefully, as if disturbing too much dust might erase something sacred. But after that, it remained largely as he had left it. A few visitors over the years were guided past the room: historians, archivists, royal guests. Some paused at the doorway, sensing a hush that felt heavier than silence. Others looked in and quickly turned away, unsure why the air inside made their chest tighten. For Elizabeth, it was different. She knew the weight that lived there. Sometimes, late in the evening, she would walk the same quiet path through the palace and find herself standing outside the door, her hand resting on the knob but not turning it. She didn't need to enter. She remembered it well enough. The way he sat slightly to one side when reading, the way his papers were stacked too neatly, a sign of anxiety, not order. The way his reading glasses were always just a bit crooked on the bridge of his nose. These memories did not fade. They lived in her steps, her gestures, her choices. And sometimes, when the burden of the crown pressed too tightly, she would let herself rest her back against the door for a moment, just long enough to feel something steady again. The room itself seemed to breathe in his absence. The scent of old paper lingered. A pale scarf he had used when unwell still hung over the back of a chair. His boots, worn but polished, stood side by side beneath a bench by the fireplace. And, on the windowsill, tucked behind a vase of dry lavender, was a small photo of Elizabeth as a child, smiling in the garden, reaching for something just outside the frame. He had kept it there, not for display, just for company. The room became a kind of quiet reliquary, not of power, but of presence. It held the echo of someone who had struggled daily to live up to a role he never asked for. And in its stillness, there was no shame, no regret, only endurance. When Elizabeth faced her own storms, scandals, losses, wars of words and hearts, she often thought of that room, not as a place to escape to, but as a symbol of how one lives quietly inside the storm, how one shows up, how one speaks even when the voice falters. And she would remember his favorite phrase, spoken once in private, long ago, when she was only a girl trying to understand why he seemed so tired. It's not about ruling. It's about remaining, about standing steady so others don't fall. That was how he had seen his role. Not as a figurehead, not as a symbol, but as a root. A deep, unseen anchor in the shifting earth of a nation at war. And the room, in its simplicity, reflected that. No golden trim, no grand desk. Just the quiet traces of a man who had held on, quietly, until he couldn't. The room remained closed. To the public, not locked, just unvisited. And perhaps that was how he would have wanted it. No monument, no shrine, just a quiet place where memory lived not in stone or gold, but in sunlight on a desk, and the echo of someone who had done his best with a role that never truly belonged to him. The crown had moved on, but the room remained. As Queen Elizabeth's reign lengthened, threading its way through decades of shifting history, there were many who looked upon her as the embodiment of endurance, the unmoved monarch in a world forever in motion. Photographs captured her, standing beside presidents, emperors, astronauts, and children. Her image appeared on currency, on stamps, on statues, on walls across continents. But beneath every ribbon she pinned, every speech she read, every silent nod she offered to her people, there remained something unspoken. The imprint of her father. Not always visible, not often named, but always there, a quiet architecture within her poise. George VI had taught her not through power, but through posture. Not through command, but through consistency. And in every moment, she carried forward. She carried him too. When she walked into rooms filled with world leaders, she remembered the way he had paused before opening a door. When she gave her annual Christmas address, she heard his stammer, not mocking her for memory, but reminding her how hard one dignity truly is. When she offered comfort after tragedy, after fires, floods, wars, and loss, she didn't speak as a figure above the people. She spoke beside them, just as he had done. And though the public rarely mentioned him now, though his name was no longer whispered on balconies or carved into newspaper headlines, he remained in the corners of her reign like a shadow cast not by darkness, but by warmth. There were moments when she stood in silence longer than protocol required. Moments when she looked out over a crowd and blinked slowly, as if seeing beyond the moment. And those who had studied her closely, those who knew the difference between ceremonial stillness and reflective stillness, they knew she was remembering the man who had taught her that presence was power, that steadiness was strength, that even when a crown is unwanted, it can still be worn with grace. The world had changed since his time. The monarchy had adapted, reshaped, survived storms he never lived to see. And still, in the middle of all that change, she had remained, just as he had. There were no grand portraits of them together in public halls, no state-funded tributes designed to frame their connection. But within her, the thread had never broken. And as she aged, the resemblance grew stronger, not in appearance, but in spirit. The quiet smile, the way her hands folded before speaking, the absence of drama in her decisions. All of it spoke of a father who had shown her, quietly, how to serve. Not to dazzle, not to dominate, but to stand. The longer she reigned, the more people began to forget the beginning. New generations knew her as the constant, the queen who had always been there. But in the archives, in the hearts of those who studied closely, the ghost of George VI remained. In his letters, in his wartime broadcasts, in the half-forgotten audio clips where a pause between words meant more than the words themselves. Historians rarely lingered on him. They passed over his reign quickly, a bridge between Edward and Elizabeth. But some began to see the truth, that it was that bridge which held everything together. Without his reluctant steadiness, the crown might have cracked. The war might have fractured morale. The monarchy itself might have drifted too far from the people to ever return. But he had held it in place, quietly, uncomfortably, honorably. And through him, Elizabeth had learned not only how to reign, but how to remain. In this way, his legacy was not written in headlines. It was written in her, in every year she served, in every ceremony she endured, in every moment she stood still when others might have fled. And though he never heard her say it aloud, though the years between them stretched longer and longer with each passing season, it was always there in her silence, the soft, unspoken gratitude for a father who had carried the crown, just long enough to teach her how. As the decades turned and Elizabeth's reign drifted into twilight, there came a shift, not in ceremony, but in spirit. Her steps slowed, but her presence remained unshaken. The world around her had changed completely. Leaders came and went like passing clouds. Nations rose and fractured. Traditions blurred into modernity, and yet she stood like a clock tower in the mist, quiet, measured, unyielding. And with that stillness came something new. Or rather, something old returning in soft waves. Memory, not the loud kind filled with applause and headlines, but the private kind, like rain tapping gently against the glass. In her solitude, Elizabeth found herself accompanied more often by ghosts than by guests. And among them, one remained constant, the first, the oldest, the most formative. Her father. She saw him now in the smallest things, in the way she touched the brim of her hat before stepping out of a car, in the hush she allowed to settle over her before delivering a message, in the weariness that rested quietly behind her eyes at the end of long days. When she sat in the palace chapel, head bowed, she sometimes imagined his presence in the pew beside her, not as a vision, not as fantasy, just as a feeling, familiar, comforting, gently sorrowful. The kind of presence that lingers long after words are gone. His picture still hung in one of her private rooms. Not the official portrait, but the quieter one. The black and white photo of him holding her hand when she was small. The two of them walking in the garden at Balmoral. His expression tired but gentle. Visitors rarely noticed it. It was half hidden, behind a stack of correspondence trays. But she noticed. Every time. And though she never spoke of it aloud, those closest to her began to sense it, the way her silences deepened. The way her gaze sometimes drifted out windows longer than Makwai. Then, before, the way her sentences paused in the middle, as if she were remembering not what to say. But who used to say it? The world outside continued to swirl, fast and full of noise. Debates about monarchy. Demands for change. Questions about legacy. But within her, there was no debate. She knew what had shaped her. She knew who had shown her the meaning of service, not with speeches, but with effort. And sometimes, in moments of quiet reflection between meetings. After ceremonies, during long flights, she would hold his voice in her mind. The way it had sounded when he read to her. The way it trembled on the radio. The way it had once whispered to her. Courage isn't loud, Lilibet. It's quiet, and it stays. And she had stayed. Through loss, through scandal, through change, through years that wore even the steadiest spirit thin, she had remained. And now, as the years collected like fallen leaves around her feet, she began to feel time moving differently. Not forward, not backward, but inward. The past was no longer something behind her. It was beside her, living with her. Walking silently. In the same halls, breathing the same air. Balmoral especially held his shadow. In the hush of the Scottish hills, the wind sometimes curled around the stone walls in ways that made her pause. She remembered his hands clasped behind his back, the way he squinted into the sun, the way he called her my girl with a pride that never needed to be explained. The staff noticed she spent more time alone in those places, longer walks, longer silences. But they didn't interrupt. They understood. A monarch carries the weight of a nation, but inside, she is still a daughter. Still someone who remembers the warmth of a hand holding hers during a frightening moment. Still someone who once watched a father stare at a microphone like it was a battlefield. Still someone who saw that same father walk into that battlefield anyway. That memory became her companion. Not heavy, not painful, just present. A soft echo. A reassurance. And as the world spoke of succession, of endings, of what might come next, she did not rush. She did not explain. She simply carried what had been handed to her as he had done before her. And perhaps in that stillness, in that quiet endurance, there lived the final shape of his legacy, not in what he did, but in who she became. Not in the size of his reign, but in the depth of hers. And now, as her shadow grew longer in the setting sun, she carried him not in grief, but in gratitude. For many years, the name George VI lived quietly beneath the surface of public memory, not forgotten, but gently folded away, like an old scarf placed in a drawer by someone who could not quite bear to part with it, yet no longer reached for. His was not the reign that filled textbooks with grand declarations or sweeping victories. He was, for a time, remembered only in relation to others, the brother who abdicated, the daughter who ruled, the war that reshaped everything. But time, with all its winding corridors, eventually turned back toward him, not through royal proclamations or institutional campaigns, but through story, through cinema, through curiosity, through the soft turning of pages in books that began to ask not what he was, but who. It began slowly, like fog lifting from a forgotten path. A new generation, far removed from the smoke of war and the formality of palaces, began to ask about the man with the stammer, the king who is never supposed to be king. They discovered the photographs, black and white, grainy, often solemn. They heard the radio broadcasts, heavy with pauses, trembling with effort. They read the letters, modest, humble, personal, And what they found was not the kind of majesty they had expected. They found humanity. And with it, admiration. Films were made, plays were staged, books were written. His speech struggles, once whispered about with embarrassment in elite circles, became a source of awe, not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. In an age that had grown weary of perfection, George VI's imperfections were rediscovered as symbols of strength. Audiences wept at scenes where he stumbled over words, not because they pitied him, but because they understood him. Because they saw in him the kind of courage they wished for themselves and in homes across the world. Viewers sat quietly as actors reenacted his story, the abdication, the unexpected crown, the battle with silence, the burden of war. Many said they felt as though they were meeting him for the first time. In a way, they were. For years, his memory had lived in shadows behind the throne, beneath the headlines. But now, it stood in the light again. Not towering, not triumphant, just standing quietly, as he had always done. The Queen never spoke publicly about these portrayals, but those close to her noticed a stillness in her expression when asked about them. Not disapproval, not nostalgia, just depth, as if she too was remembering, and perhaps even discovering parts of him that she had never seen while he was alive. After all, daughters remember their fathers in one way. The world remembers them in another. And sometimes, only when both views are placed side by side, does the full picture begin to emerge. Royal Archive saw an increase in requests to study his correspondence. Museums began to consider exhibitions featuring his era. Schools started mentioning him more frequently, not as a footnote, but as a figure worth pausing for. And in one quiet corner of Windsor, a new plaque was affixed to the wall near his old study. It didn't list titles. It didn't boast of accomplishments. It read simply, "He carried the crown with quiet strength. He led with heart, not noise." Tour guides read the line aloud to visitors, many of whom stood in silence afterward, unsure why their chest felt suddenly heavier. It was not sadness. It was recognition. The recognition of a truth that history sometimes forgets to tell. That some of the most important leaders are not the loudest, not the boldest, but the ones who show up. Day after day, without applause, without ego, simply because the world needs them too. That was who George VI had been. And now, at last, the world was remembering him not as a placeholder or a bridge between monarchs, but as a man, a reluctant king, a loving father, a voice that shook but still spoke. And in that remembrance, he was restored to the throne he had never sought, not through gold or ceremony, but through story. By the time her grandchildren were old enough to understand who their great-grandfather had been, George VI had already become a shadow in the palace, familiar in name but distant in sound. His voice, once a hesitant anchor during war, had long since faded from daily memory. None of them had ever heard it in real time. They had only the grainy recordings, the sepia-toned film clips, the occasional black and white still where his eyes seemed to be looking just beyond the frame. And yet, he lived in the quiet fabric of their lives. His study still existed, tucked away in the quieter wing of the palace, never locked, but rarely disturbed. His portraits still hung in places most visitors never entered. And when they passed through those halls, the grandchildren sometimes paused, not to examine the face, but to feel something. An echo, a pause, a presence that had shaped everything, even if they hadn't witnessed it firsthand. Their grandmother, the Queen, did not speak often of him. But when she did, it was with a softness that none of her public speeches carried. She would sometimes mention his long walks in the garden, his quiet breakfasts, his fondness for simple, silent moments. Never grand stories, just fragments. Sentences that hung in the air like lanterns. Once, When one of the younger royals asked her what he had taught her most, she paused a long time before replying that the most important part of a crown is the part no one sees. It was not a line from a speech. It was not rehearsed. It was memory. And though the younger generation had been born into a very different world, one filled with flashing cameras, swirling headlines, and questions about what the monarchy should become, they felt, in their own way, a kind of reverence for the man who had made it possible for the institution to survive its darkest hour. Some of them watched the films made about him. One grandson, after watching a dramatization of George VI's life, reportedly sat in silence for some time and then said, "I wish I could have just had tea with him." It wasn't a grand sentiment, but it captured the feeling that surrounded the king. Not awe, not legend, but longing. Not for what he ruled, but for who he had been. The family began to speak of him a little more. Quietly, gently. A letter of his was framed and placed in one of the lesser-known guest rooms at Balmoral. A speech of his broken, imperfect, brave, was played on the anniversary of his passing during a small family gathering. These were not acts of official remembrance. They were personal, and in those private spaces where royalty became simply family, George VI returned, not as a king, but as a thread. A gentle presence woven into the identity of a family still trying to walk the same delicate line he once did, between duty and self, between silence and strength. One great-granddaughter began a journal after learning of his lifelong struggle with speech. She wrote about her own fears, her own quiet battles. She said it made her feel closer to him. As if, even across the decades, the crown still connected those who had never met. In these small moments, the man who once feared microphones became a guide to those born into noise. In a world that shouted louder with each passing year, his life became a reminder that steadiness did not require volume, that love did not always need expression, that service could be quiet and still be seen. And so the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, even those not yet born when he had walked the halls of Windsor, began to carry him forward in quiet ways. A flower left beneath his portrait, a pause before a speech, a handwritten note tucked into a pocket. Nothing official, nothing rehearsed, just fragments of memory passed down like stories around a fire. And though they would never hear his voice as it truly was, trembling, tired, determined, they would know what it meant. They would understand what their grandmother meant when she closed her eyes and said, "He taught me how to carry the weight without letting it change the way I stand." And perhaps, in that understanding, his voice lived on, not through recordings, but through posture, presence, and the quiet decision to remain steady even when the world does not see. Before he was king, before the microphones, before the war and the weight and the crown he never wanted, he was simply Bertie, a young, quiet man with tired eyes and a trembling voice. And she was Elizabeth Bosleyan, lively, intelligent, warm in a way that slipped past the frost of royal etiquette. When he first proposed to her, she said no, not because she didn't care for him, but because she feared what life inside the palace might cost her soul. But he asked again and again, and eventually she said yes, not to the crown, not to the future, but to him. And in that one decision, she became the quiet pillar that would hold him upright for the rest of his life. She was not the queen people wrote novels about. She did not hunger for attention. She did not sculpt policy or dictate the pace of the kingdom. But she was always there, steady, smiling, standing just behind him with a presence as vital as breath. In public, she looked graceful, unmoved, but in private, she understood the storm. She knew his stammer wasn't simply a speech difficulty. It was the echo of deeper doubt, a constant reminder of the boy who had once cried in frustration because the words wouldn't come. And so she waited, always, gently, patiently. She sat beside him during late-night rehearsals, whispered encouragement before addresses, squeezed his hand under the table when the silence between syllables grew too long. She never rushed him, never corrected, never flinched. She simply remained. In a world of appearances, where kings were expected to be marble statues and queens ornamental at best, she offered something far more valuable: presence without pressure. She knew when to speak for him and when not to speak at all. And, though the world often missed it, her quiet influence held up the edges of his reign like a seamstress mending something fragile before it tears. During the war, when the bombing of London sent the aristocracy fleeing to country estates, she stayed by his side. And Buckingham Palace was struck, she brushed plastered dust from her hair and said, "Now I can look the East End in the face." And it wasn't just words, it was how she looked at him, not as a man diminished by fear, but as someone who carried fear with grace. Someone who had been asked to do the unthinkable and said yes anyway. Behind every one of his appearances was her quiet touch. Behind every shaky sentence was her quiet belief. She never tried to change him, only to steady him. She made him laugh softly when the palace grew too cold. She held his gaze when the room was too crowded. And when the crown finally rested on his head, she stood beside him, not because she had dreamed of being queen, but because she knew he hadn't. After his death, she mourned in silence. Not with dramatic gestures, not with speeches. With small rituals, placing fresh flowers on his desk, rereading letters he had written, walking their garden paths alone. People called her the Queen Mother in time. They bowed to her, admired her hats, quoted her quips. But behind the soft eyes and firm smiles was a grief that had no stage, because no one else had known the battles she had seen. No one else had heard the tears behind closed doors. No one else had carried that silence beside him for so long. In many ways, she had been his first and only audience, the one who had heard every word he couldn't quite say. And now, without him, the rooms echoed differently. She would live for decades beyond him. She would see her daughter reign, her grandchildren rise. The world changed so completely, it became nearly unrecognizable. But through it all, she carried him. Not as sorrow, but as story, as reminder, as proof that even the quietest kings need someone to believe in them when their voice falters. And in the end, when people remembered her, her wit, her grace, her steady presence, they often forgot that her greatest act was not public at all. It was loving a man who doubted himself into becoming a king. If history had access only to what was said in public, it would never fully understand King George VI. His speeches, though courageous, were sculpted with care, polished by advisors, softened by repetition, and often shaped more by duty than desire. What the world heard was only the final version, the one that made it past the stammer, the fear, the long hours of rehearsal. But it was in private, in the quiet corners of his mind, that his truest voice lived. And though he rarely spoke freely, he did write, not often, not for publication, but in scattered journals and handwritten letters, tucked in drawers and sealed in envelopes never meant for eyes beyond the family. These writings were not grand. They were not literary or sweeping, but they were honest, uneven lines on textured paper. Some entries were no longer than a paragraph. Others just a few sentences, a question, a hope, a confession. He never kept a formal diary, perhaps because he feared recording too much. But when the weight of the crown pressed too heavily on his chest, he turned to pen and paper and let the words fall where his voice could not carry them. "I still do not feel like a king," he wrote once. "Not in the way they expect. I suppose I do not know how to be anyone but myself, and he is not very grand." In another letter to Elizabeth, sent but never spoken of, he said, "If ever you feel small beneath the weight of it all, remember the crown is heavy only because it must be worn with both hands. These fragments, now housed in sealed archives or kept in a few trusted family boxes, painted a picture far deeper than the uniformed portraits ever could. They showed a man struggling with the idea that he had been chosen by absence, not by destiny, that his brother's love had made him a monarch, and that the world's need had kept him there. He often wondered if he had done enough. He rarely believed he had. "I am not brave," he wrote in one winter entry. "I only appear so because I am too proud to show how frightened I really am." These were not the words of a king in gold. They were the words of a man in quiet war with himself, a war no one else could see. And perhaps that was why they mattered. Because in their rawness, they gave voice to every person who had ever been given a responsibility they did not ask for, and carried it anyway. His handwriting changed over the years. In earlier letters, it was neat, spaced carefully. But as the war progressed and his health declined, it became tighter, slanted, sometimes crossed out in frustration. He often began a sentence only to scratch it out and begin again. But he never threw the page away. He understood something about imperfection, that it could be more revealing than perfection ever would be. One of the final notes he wrote weeks before his death was never addressed. It simply said, "If the people think me steady, then I have done well enough. I would rather be remembered as quiet than grand. I never meant to be either." That note, written on a plain sheet of cream paper, was found folded in his pocket after he passed. It was never read at his funeral. It was never engraved in stone. But it remained passed gently from one set of royal hands to another. A private inheritance, not of jewels, but of truth. The Queen kept that paper. She did not frame it. She did not quote it, but she kept it close, folded, and tucked into a small drawer of personal keepsakes. Because it said everything he had never said aloud, not to the nation, not to the world, not even to her. And yet it had always been there, between the pauses in his speeches, behind the shake in his hands, beneath the steady surface he had worked so hard to maintain. The voice of a man who did not want the crown, but wore it anyway. Not for glory, but for love, for country, for duty, for the quiet belief that sometimes being present is enough. And in those pages, not broadcasted, not carved, was the truest record of his reign, not written for legacy, but simply because. The words had to go somewhere. The final days of King George VI were not marked by fanfare or grand farewells. They were quiet, almost unnoticeable, like the slow dimming of a lantern in a distant room. His body, worn by years of tension, illness, and unsought responsibility, had begun to slow long before anyone admitted it aloud. Doctors came and went with calm expressions and careful words, but those closest to him could see it in the way he breathed more shallowly, in the way he paused longer between sentences, in the way his eyes, once constantly watching, now lingered more in stillness than in focus. He was not yet old, but the war had aged him. The crown had aged him. Even love, in all its quiet comfort, could not stop the slow unraveling of a man who had carried more than he could speak of. In those final months, he spent more time at Sandringham, the royal estate tucked in the English countryside, far from London's noise, far from palace corridors echoing with footsteps and clipped conversations. At Sandringham there was only wind and trees and the sound of birds passing overhead without ceremony. There, in the soft calm of winter light, he would walk the garden slowly, sometimes alone, sometimes with the Queen, their steps in rhythm without needing words. She did not speak often in those moments. She did not ask him how he felt. She already knew. Their conversations had never needed the burden of explanation. It was a companionship built on presence, the quiet awareness of what was being carried. Between them, in the evenings, he would sit by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes simply gazing into the flames. His dog lay at his feet. The queen nearby, knitting or reading, or simply watching over him with the same steady gaze she had carried since their wedding. Elizabeth, their daughter, was away in Kenya on official duty. She had kissed his cheek before departing, and he had smiled, telling her she was doing well. But even in that smile, something in her had paused a hesitation, a flicker of awareness that perhaps this goodbye might be heavier than it seemed. He had said very little, but his hand lingered on hers longer than usual. The day before his death, he wrote a short note to her. It wasn't ceremonial. It didn't carry the weight of legacy or command. It simply read, "Be steady, not perfect. You already are more than I ever dreamed." That note, handwritten and folded carefully, was left on his bedside table to be sent in the morning. But the morning never came for him. In the early hours of February 6, 1952, the king passed away in his sleep. There was no struggle, no drama, just stillness. A final breath, soft and full of surrender. The nurse who checked on him later said it looked as though he had simply fallen deeper into sleep, that he looked more peaceful than she had ever seen him. And perhaps that was the most fitting end for a king who had reigned with such internal noise to find, at last, a silence that did not demand anything of him. Word of his death spread through the palace like a slow-moving fog. Curtains were drawn, bells were prepared, but no one rushed. Everyone moved carefully, as if their own noise might wake him. Elizabeth was told mid-chore, beneath the Kenyan sky, standing in a world of color and heat and distant birdsong. Her face changed, not with shock, but with a stillness that came from deep within. She was no longer just a daughter. She was now the queen. But for a moment, a long, silent moment, she was only a girl who had lost her father. She stood very still. She closed her eyes. And then she stepped forward. She did not cry publicly. She did not speak immediately. She simply moved, steady, measured, quiet. The same way he had moved through his reign. Back in England, the preparations for mourning began. The black drapes, the quiet footsteps, the ceremonial announcements. But beneath it all was something else, a kind of sacred hush. A reverence not for power, but for endurance. His body lay in state, and thousands came to pay respects. Many did not speak. They simply stood before the coffin, eyes low, hearts full of memories they could not explain. Memories of a voice that had trembled, of a king who had tried. There was no music at first, no choirs, just the soft shuffle of feet and the occasional cough, and the sound of breath held and released again. Because in that silence, something was being understood, not just that he had died, but that he had mattered, that in carrying a crown he never wanted, he had taught the world something rare: how to lead with humility, how to speak through struggle, how to remain steady in the storm. And when the crown passed to Elizabeth, it did not glitter, it did not sing. It rested gently in her hands, heavy with history, but also with love. The kind of love only a daughter could carry forward. For the father who had shown her how, the crown did not wait for morning. It never had. And so, in the days after her father's death, Elizabeth returned to England not as a daughter in grief, but as a sovereign in silence. The change was invisible but absolute, a shift felt not in the air, but in the stillness that surrounded her wherever she went. She stepped from the plane as a queen, but behind her eyes lingered the ache of unfinished goodbyes. Her voice was steady, her posture composed, her words respectful, but her heart moved differently now, no longer beating only for herself. The funeral was arranged swiftly, as state funerals always are, and the plans moved like clockwork through the machinery of monarchy. But for her, each moment moved more slowly than time could measure. Each bow, each wreath, each echoing hymn was not just ritual, it was memory. She walked behind the casket with a stillness that felt older than her years. At just 25, she had stepped into a role carved by centuries, wearing the weight of generations and the fresh sorrow of losing the only man who had ever shown her how to carry it. She did not cry in front of the world. She did not falter. But those who stood close to her said her breath sometimes caught just before she spoke, as if his voice, or its absence, still lingered near. She visited the chapel alone one morning before the public ceremonies began, arriving in a simple coat, her eyes cast downward. The chapel was quiet, filled only with pale light and the scent of old wood and fresh lilies. His casket was still, there closed and draped. She stood beside it for a long time without speaking. No advisors, no photographers, just a daughter and a father, separated by duty, connected by love. She placed a letter beside the flowers. No one ever read it. It was taken with him, a final exchange, not royal, just human. And then she turned, lifted her chin softly, and left the room, because the world was waiting. And she knew, just as he had known, that when a crown is passed, it is not only gold that moves, it is the silence, the sorrow, the burden, and the promise. Her reign began in a storm of headlines, travel, addresses, and expectations. Cameras followed her every step, recording not just her words, but her composure. But inside, she was grieving. Quietly, slowly. The kind of grief that doesn't announce itself, but settles beneath the skin and changes the shape of thought. Her mother was grieving too, of course. But even in that shared loss, Elizabeth was now separate, placed by history into a role that allowed no space for public fragility. She learned quickly to hold the weight behind her eyes, to lace her voice with poise even when her chest ached. And yet, through it all, she felt him not in signs or symbols, but in rhythm, in the way she approached the microphone and took a moment before speaking, in the way she sat through council meetings with a silence that commanded more than speech, in the way she shook hands with war veterans, looking them in the eye, never rushing, always seeing. He had done these things. She had watched him do them, and now, without thinking, she carried his movements forward. Her coronation would come later, grand and golden and public. But these quiet days, these first steps into sovereignty, were more sacred, because in them she was not just becoming queen. She was completing something unfinished, carrying the story her father had started. Walking through the doorway he had opened, answering the silence he had left behind. And though the world celebrated a new era, though papers wrote of youth and hope and modernity, she knew something deeper, that everything she was about to do had been shaped by the man who had never wanted to be king, and became one anyway. In those first weeks, she often returned to Balmoral. There, in the quiet hills and the cold morning air, she could breathe again, not as a monarch, but as a daughter. She walked the same paths he had once walked, stood in the same rooms. And sometimes she sat by the window, watching the clouds pass over the peaks, letting the silence speak in his absence. No words, no script. Just the echo of a love that had taught her how to hold still, even when the world moved too fast. As the years unfurled like long, slow ribbons of history, Queen Elizabeth's reign stretched far beyond what anyone had expected, not because she fought to stay, but because she never let go of the stillness her father had taught her. Through changing governments, shifting empires, scandals, wars, and the relentless tick of time, she remained quiet, present, and impossibly steady. And though her face became familiar to billions, though her name was etched into currency and woven into the identity of nations, she never placed herself at the center of her own story. Instead, she stood slightly to the side, like her father once had, letting the world move around her while she held it gently in place. His influence was never obvious. It didn't shout from headlines or announce itself in policies. It lived in her silences, in the way she chose not to comment, in the pauses she allowed before answering, in the simple fact that she endured, year after year, decade after decade, not with noise, but with presence. She never declared her father a role model. She didn't need to. Everything about the way she ruled was built from his quiet example. She carried on through crises by showing up calmly, without changing her tone. She held firm in sorrow by walking among her people, listening without interrupting. She kept the monarchy afloat, not by reinventing it entirely, but by giving it something it had nearly lost: humility. And in this way, the shadow of George VI lengthened quietly behind her, not as something dark, but as something cool and comforting, like the shade of a tree planted long ago by hands that never sought attention. His lessons lived in her posture, in her decision to greet leaders not with grandeur, but with grace, in her refusal to chase popularity, choosing instead to serve with the patience of someone who understood that true power lies in consistency, not spectacle. When younger royals made headlines, when the world changed faster than tradition could adapt, she remained rooted, and people looked to her not for flash, but for calm. That calm had been born of watching her father struggle to speak, yet never choosing silence, of watching him battle with self-doubt, yet never refusing the task. She had seen, from the earliest years of her life, that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispered. And so, she whispered too. Not in volume, but in the way she ruled, in her resilience, in her refusal to center herself, in the steadiness of her gaze, her hands, her measured words. In later years, when she stood on balconies alone, waving to seas of people who had only ever known her as queen, she sometimes wondered, quietly, always quietly, what he might have thought, if he would have been proud, if he would have smiled his soft, uncertain smile, if he would have said, as he once had when she was a child, "You've done it better than I ever could." And though no one could ever answer those questions, she carried the feeling that he was never far. When she visited war memorials, when she pinned medals to the jackets of those who had once followed her father's voice into battle, when she stood beside Churchill, beside Mandela, beside people whose lives had unfolded in the shadow of a crown her father had worn with such humility. His reign had been brief, hesitant, strained, but from it had grown the most enduring reign in modern history. And though the world gave Elizabeth's credit, as it should, she never let herself forget the soil in which she had been planted. That man who had not wanted the throne, but carried it anyway. The father who taught her how to stand tall, not by raising her voice, but by keeping her promises. That was the legacy she honored, not through speeches, but through quiet. And in that quiet, he lived on, not as a ghost, but as a foundation, not as a statue, but as a shadow, the kind that follows you all your life, not to haunt you, but to remind you where you came from. As Queen Elizabeth's reign reached its twilight, the world slowly began to look backward, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity, to understand how such a quiet figure had come to define an age. Reporters used words like steadfast and timeless. Historians spoke of her as an anchor in turbulent waters. People who had grown up with her image in their homes suddenly realized they had never known life without her. And with that realization came a ripple, soft but steady, a return to where it all began, to the man who had handed her the crown, not in triumph, but in silence. George VI, his name, once fading gently into history's shadows, began to surface again in the footnotes, the documentaries, the whispered reflections of those trying to make sense of a century shaped by stillness. They began to see her reign, not as a single unbroken line, but as a continuation of his, not in style, but in spirit. A daughter carrying her father's posture into a world he could never have imagined. And as they looked back at him, at the hesitant monarch, the reluctant speaker, The quiet father who became a symbol of wartime resolve. The world began to see not just a placeholder king, but the beginning of something enduring. They saw that his reign, brief and burdened though it was, had planted the seeds of everything she became. That the woman who stood through scandals and storms had learned to do so by watching a man stand through war and worry and whispers of inadequacy. That her crown had been shaped by his hands, worn thin by doubt but held firm by love. In exhibitions, his artifacts were displayed beside hers. His speech notes, with penciled corrections and phrases crossed out in frustration, lay beside her immaculate addresses. His modest suits, still bearing the scent of tobacco and old leather, hung beside her tailored gowns. And the people, the visitors, the curious, stood in long lines, not just to see her legacy, but to understand his. Because now they could feel it, that his voice, which once stammered across the radio, had never truly stopped speaking. It had simply continued through her, through the steadiness of her reign, through the rhythm of her footsteps in long palace corridors, through the soft lines on her face that time could not smooth away. In speeches about resilience, in ceremonies of remembrance, in portraits painted and placed beside his, the narrative began to shift. He was no longer just the king who followed an abdication. He was the monarch who modeled grace under pressure, the father who gave the world a queen, the man who had shown, in the quietest way possible, how to bear something too heavy and still keep walking. And within Elizabeth, there lived the soft echo of all he had endured. She never said it aloud. She didn't need to. It was in her hands, her gaze, her patience. When foreign leaders bowed too deeply, when journalists asked too many questions, when generations wondered what it meant to rule without demanding, it was him they saw through her. The last years of her life were marked by more reflection than ambition. She visited the places that shaped her, not as queen, but as daughter. Balmoral, Windsor, Sandringham, and in each place the silence greeted her like an old friend. She would sit in the rooms where he once sat, walk the gardens where he once paced. And sometimes those close to her said she would pause, her hand resting lightly on a banister, her gaze cast outward, and it would seem as though she were listening, not to a voice exactly, but to memory, to the breath of someone who had never truly left, to the presence of a man who had given her the tools to rule without ever claiming them for himself. And as the world began to prepare for a time beyond her to ask what would come next, there was comfort in looking back. Back to him, to the man who never wanted the crown, who wore it quietly, and whose greatest achievement was not carved in monuments, but carried in the heart of a daughter who stood for a lifetime just as he once had, in the service of something greater than herself. So now, let us walk slowly through the final chapter, not in haste, not in grandeur, but with the same quiet rhythm that marked the lives of a father and daughter, bound not by ambition, but by the gentle weight of duty. King George VI, who never wanted to wear the crown, and Queen Elizabeth II, who never put it down. Two lives intertwined, not just by blood, but by silence, the kind that lingers in rooms long after voices fade, the kind that teaches not by instruction, but by example. As the Queen reached the final years of her reign, there was a softness to her presence. She moved more carefully now, with steps measured not by weakness, but by reflection. Her hands, once firm and unwavering, carried the grace of someone who had held too many hands, signed too many papers, offered too many condolences to ever count. But it was her eyes that told the story. They no longer scanned the room. They remembered it. They looked through time, through people, through ceremony, and into something deeper. She had become the very image of continuity. For most alive, she had always been there, a constant, a symbol, a gentle thread through the years. But within her, the thread began much earlier. Long before the robes and the parades. Long before the camera flashes and state visits. It began in a quiet hallway of a palace where a young girl watched her father struggle to speak and do it. Anyway, that was the inheritance she carried. Not jewels, not titles, but a model. A lesson whispered, not shouted. A story of endurance, not dominance. George VI had taught her without ever needing to declare it, that real power lies in showing up when you'd rather not. In speaking, even when the words refuse to come, in standing still while the world changes around you. And so she did, for more than 70 years. In storms and celebrations, in grief and ceremony, in war and in peace, she stood, and through her he remained. His voice echoed not through her speeches, but through the spaces between them. His memory lived not on coins or flags, but in the quiet way she held herself, dignified, unshaken, endlessly steady. In her final decade, she began to retreat softly from public life. Not disappearing, but gently withdrawing, the way the tide pulls back from the shore, not to vanish, but to rest. She delegated more, watched more, walked more slowly. And perhaps, though she never said so, she began to prepare, not just herself, but the nation, the family, the world, for a time when the crown would move again. She had done her part, and in doing it, she had honored his. When the day finally came, the day the news broke, the day the world learned that Queen Elizabeth II had passed, it felt, for many, like a clock had stopped ticking. Not just a monarch, but an era, a presence that had filled generations, with a sense of continuity, was suddenly, softly gone. Across the world, people wept. Not loudly, not always publicly, but deeply, because it felt personal, as though something stable had been removed from the room. The headlines spoke of history, of record-breaking reigns, of global influence. But in private, what people mourned was something harder to name, a kind of gentle strength that had been with them, unnoticed, like sunlight through a window. And as the tributes poured in, something remarkable happened. The story began not just with her, but with him. Its people remembered. They spoke again of George VI, of the man who had been handed the crown only because his brother left it behind. Of the king who had stammered through war, who had trembled in private but stood tall in public, who had loved quietly, suffered quietly, reigned quietly, and from whose example had come a queen who did the same. Images of him reappeared, his hand in hers when she was young, his worried eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, his weary smile on the day he watched her wave from a balcony, not knowing it would one day be hers. And now, in the final chapter, their story was told together, not as two monarchs in succession, but as one unbroken arc of grace. He had reigned for 16 years, she for 70. And yet the space between them had never widened. In every decision she made, he was there. In every room she entered, he had once stood. In every speech she gave, the silence he once carried lived in the pauses. At her funeral, they played his favorite hymn, not because it had been planned that way, but because someone remembered. And beneath the vaulted ceilings, amid the flickering candlelight and solemn music, there was a sense that something had come full circle, not closed, just completed. A father and daughter, reunited not in majesty, but in memory. Their lives had not been defined by desire for the throne, neither had chosen it. Both had served it, and in doing so, they had reshaped what monarchy meant, not a performance, but a presence, not a command, but a comfort, not perfection, but endurance. As the crown moved once again, passed now into the hands of a new generation, carried forward into another chapter, it carried not just the weight of tradition, but the echo of two quiet reigns, of a man who never wanted it, and a daughter who never let it fall. And maybe that's how history works best, Not in headlines or monuments, but in quiet inheritances, the kind passed in gestures, in examples, in soft reminders. George VI did not leave a legacy of revolution or splendor. He left something harder and more valuable, the model of how to bear something silently, lovingly, completely. And Elizabeth carried it, all of it, until her very last breath. And now, as we close this long, slow story, let us remember them not as rulers carved into stone, but as two souls who stood beneath the same invisible weight and never turned away. Not once. They remained. And in their quiet, they taught us something. Loud that steadiness is a kind of love, and that the crown, heavy as it may be, can be worn with grace, even by those who never asked for it.